Welcome to Arthurian April, day 26. And today we are going to tackle a topic that I have evaded a little bit. We have stayed very firmly, for the most part, in the Middle Ages, in the 12th and 13th centuries, occasionally foraying into the 15th century. But I have been remiss in one particular topic. And it is very important because so much of what this period understood about King Arthur has influenced everything that came after. We are, of course, talking about the Victorians. As a medievalist, Victorians, we have an interesting relationship because so much of what we know and how things are perceived and changed really went through the lens of Victorian minds. And in particular, in Arthuriana, we look at the Pre-Raphaelites and we look at Alfred Lord Tennyson. So we're going to start with Tennyson. Tennyson is born sort of after the explosion of romantic poetry that comes at the beginning of the 19th century. Fun fact about me, John Keats is one of my favorite writers of all time. Spent a lot of time reading the Romantics. Tennyson was interesting because he was still old enough to have met some of these people, but young enough that their work was sort of in the background of his childhood. He was a big fan of Byron. I don't know if that speaks well or ill of the man, but just something to keep in mind. Tennyson was born to a middle-class family, was not born into the peerage. That happened much, much later, but his life was punctuated with some pretty significant loss, including one of his best friends, and just living in a time where things were a little bit tumultuous. The Victorian era is one that he really kind of saw from beginning to near end. His rise to fame was pretty fast. When he was at Cambridge, one of his poems was given the Chancellor's Award, but he was so brokenhearted, I guess, or discouraged by many of the reviews of his first group of poems, that he took 10 years to not publish for a while, to just kind of live in his own misery. He did keep writing. He was an absolute nitpicky is a good word. If you know anything about Walt Whitman, he was a similar kind of fellow who would write and revise and write and revise, to the point where one of Tennyson's friends said that he was, in fact, insane for the process of his editing, that it was to the point that it excluded all else, and he became so incredibly hyperfixated, my words, not his, that the rest of the world kind of ceased to exist a little bit. Intriguingly, and I'm a neurodivergent person. My house is full of neurodivergent people. I read things like that, and I certainly see something going on there. We also know that Tennyson had a brother who was put in a private asylum for, we don't know exactly what, or at least the things that I've read didn't really clarify that, but just interesting that some of these characteristics are things that you can see with various forms of neurodivergence, and I always like reading between the lines with this stuff. His contribution to Arthurian lore is his work, which is the Idylls of the King, or the Idylls of the King, which are a series of poems that span a bit of time in Camelot and were written over the course of his life. The Lady of Shalott being the most famous in his time, and also still the most famous to this day. Because he lived in this time of sort of intense critique and criticism, we know a lot of what people thought about Tennyson. And the poetry is technically very good. His attention to language, to internal rhyme, onomatopoeia, all of these technical terms that we know from poetry, is really amazing. But it is also very florid. So you want to talk about the extreme Victorian emotional outpourings. That is very, very much Tennyson. And that's made some of the work a little bit harder to continue, I think, in terms of popularity. But even at the time, people were like, dude is a lot. Like, this stuff is a lot. W.H. Auden, who is one of my favorite poets and writers as well, had a very fascinating thing to say of Tennyson and his work, which is that Tennyson, quote, had the finest ear perhaps of any English poet. He was also undoubtedly the stupidest. Tennyson also had a friendship with Queen Victoria, which is how he got his peerage. She loved his work, and he was the poet laureate, the longest standing poet laureate of England. He also massively influenced the Pre-Raphaelites. We talked a little bit about William Morris and his art and his poetry, The Defense of Guinevere, but not the only one. And certainly the paintings that we see of this time absolutely reflect this sort of gauzy, overwrought Victorian concept of what the Middle Ages was. We're talking Rossetti, we're talking about all the folks like Waterhouse that were painting along those times. I do love this particular painting here of the Grail Maiden by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The red hair, it's just perfect. Frederick Sands also has one of my favorites, which is this particular painting of Morgan Le Fay. I just love it. It's just fantastic. It's interesting to me because this is a time when, printed artwork is finding its way into the masses. So you kind of have this multimedia approach to King Arthur that we've never had before. Many of the Pre-Raphaelites have this sort of idealized version of the Camelot story where everyone is very clean, everyone is very beautiful. There's not as much grit to it. It occasionally comes out, but overall not so much. And that definitely reflects how Tennyson was writing. There's something kind of scrubbed clean about the work he's doing, especially taking things from Malory. And you can imagine that talking about a kingdom in decline is probably not the smartest thing to do when one of your biggest patrons is the longest reigning monarch of all England. So he was definitely playing it safe. And by no means was Tennyson the only poet of this period writing. There are so many of them, and if you go to the Rochester University's Camelot Project, you will find tons of them, including quite a few by William Morris, and then some by women writers as well. So this was an influence that, went really, really deep in the culture. It's all very idealized, though, and you certainly see that reflected of the time in the height of the Victorian era. Being English and being successful and this sort of stable monarchy was such a big deal. And their love of Victoria, their love of being British totally makes sense that this would end up being something that they all glommed onto quite seriously. And I admit, I love the Pre-Raphaelites version of Tennyson far more than Tennyson's writing. I do also feel that it is overwritten and florid, but so many of the paintings that were created as well as the sketches absolutely influenced everything. I wanted to write a fantasy of Arthur that was worthy of that level of aesthetic beauty, especially in these powerful, strong, gorgeous women. There are also a number of plays, including from Matthew Arnold, that cast these characters in, and we do even have some photographs of later productions down to the armor and everything. It's very cool. I'm going to read you a little bit from Lancelot and Elaine, which is, of course, about Lancelot and Elaine of Astolat. She has just expired from grief and just floating down the barge, in her barge on the water, and the queen and Arthur and everyone finds her, and they're all sort of talking about this, and there's a letter from her to Lancelot, and I always thought this part was kind of cool. While thus they babbled of the king came girt with knights, then turned the tongueless man from the half face to the full eye, and rose and pointed to the damsel and the doors. So Arthur had the meek Sir Percival and pure Sir Galahad to uplift the maid, and reverently they bore her into the hall. Then came the fine Gawain, and wondered at her, and Launcelot later came and mused at her, and last the queen herself, and pitied her. But Arthur spied the letter in her hand, stooped, took, brake seal, and read it. This was all. My most noble lord, Sir Launcelot of the Lake, I sometime called the Maid of Astolat. Come, for you left me taking no farewell, hither to take my last farewell of you. I loved you, and my love had no return, and therefore my true love has been my death. And therefore to our Lady Guinevere, and to all other ladies, I make moan. Pray for my soul, and yield me burial. Pray for my soul too, Sir Launcelot, as thou art a knight peerless. And you wonder why I don't adore Lancelot. Anyway, if you are in the mood for some absolutely deep, interesting, florid Victorian poetry, Tennyson is your man.